Tonight I'm going to cover a story I found to be quite interesting. The last 3 stories I covered was of a murder, where it was a one-time act for the offender. In this case, we are going to be talking about a serial killer. I did one story that is ongoing that takes place in Spokane, Washington, and tonight we're headed back to the Pacific Northwest. It takes place in Olalla, Washington, which is a tiny town in Kitsap County close to Seattle. It's still there today with a population of less than 5,000. In the early 1900s, its ports were used to transport goods using steamships and for people to get from one place to another. It was a big town for logging, and as a rural community, there was an abundance of farms. The setting for this story is the early 1900s. A woman came to town. She claimed to be a fasting specialist and said that fasting can cure anyone's ailment no matter what it is. She would starve people so close to death. Some would end up dying. Some would end up surviving and say that they were cured and that she saved their life. I think she actually believed in what she was doing, but she didn't actually care about her patients. She had complete control over them. If they lived, she was a hero to them. If they died, she found a way to take their possessions and their property. So to her, this was a win-win no matter what the outcome, because when people started dying, she realized she could get away with it. The sanitarium she worked out of was called Wilderness Heights, but people would learn to know it as Starvation Heights. This is the story of Dr. Linda Hazzard. Dorothea Williamson, or Dora as she liked to be called, was born in Trichinopoly, India, to parents George and Rosalita Delmeda Williamson, circa 1873. In 1877, the family had moved to London, England, and sister Claire was born. Their father was an English officer in the Imperial Army Medical Service. Claire and Dora would be very close all throughout their life. They knew they could depend on each other if nobody else. They lost their father 2 months after Claire was born. They also lost their mother when the pair were only teenagers, and they had 2 other sisters, Ethel and Gertrude, that would fall victim to scarlet fever at a young age. The 2 girls had inherited Australian stock from their wealthy grandfather Charles Williamson when he passed, which was worth more than $1 million US. The girls would travel all over the world, from Australia to France, to Canada, to the US, and many places in between. They were able to spend money on luxurious hotels, beautiful clothing, and fancy restaurants, and they would own property in these countries as well. They were still close with family that was not immediate, and would visit aunts, uncles, and cousins whenever they could. But there was one person in their lives that stood out and had basically replaced their mother, and that was Governess Margaret Conway, who was from Australia. She loved the girls and always treated them like they were her own children. The girls would call her Tootie. While they would spend a great deal of money on their travels, they were very protective of their wealth. They would get propositioned by people all the time about the best way to invest their money, but they were really careful and smart not to fall into a scam the next fast talker might be selling. But one thing they would not put a price on was their health. They had some health issues they thought they should get looked at. Dora believed she had swollen glands and acute rheumatic pains. Claire had seen an osteopath who said her uterus had dropped and she had inflamed ovaries. She had constant stomach pain and determined this was the reason for it. The sisters were staying at a hotel in British Columbia, Canada called the Empress when they learned of a book from a news ad they thought might be the answer to their health and happiness. The book was called Fasting for the Cure of the Disease. The title is what intrigued Claire the most. The book was written by Linda Hazzard. Linda Hazzard was born Linda Laura Burfield on December 18, 1867 in Carver, Minnesota. She was one of 8 children to Susanna Neal Mantgomery Burfield. Hazzard would become a leading proponent of fasting and she would say that the body needed to get rid of toxins that would throw the body out of balance. She believed that fasting and cleansing the body through constant enemas could cure any ailment. She would move to Seattle and eventually open a sanitarium in Olalla, Washington. She did not have a medical degree but was able to hold a license as a fasting specialist. The state of Washington would allow people to hold licenses for alternative medicines even if they did not pass the required test to hold a degree. Hazzard would have a son, Roland, from her first marriage. He would try to be an actor when he got older, but it didn't work out too well for him. He would go on to be a movie projectionist. Also, that first marriage would be a failure as well. Linda would marry a second time to a man named Samuel Hazzard, a former Army lieutenant. He would be her partner in crime, literally, and he was just as greedy as she was. Years after the marriage began, it was found out he was already married, and he would serve a couple years in prison for polygamy. Linda would end up taking him back when he got out, and she would go so far as to try to have the other wife arrested for lying. Claire and Linda Hazzard would actually correspond through letters about Claire and Dora's health issues. Hazzard would usually send a bill for the advice she gave. Claire would see an osteopath in Riverside, California in November 1910 to help with her uterus problem. The doctor would have Claire put cotton in her vagina that had been doused in glycerin and boric acid. This had to be held in all day, 3 days a week. It was supposed to strengthen the ligaments and muscles that held the uterus up. Claire felt complete discomfort from this, and she decided shortly after she and Dora needed to go to Seattle to see Dr. Hazzard, because the fasting idea was the way to go. And with the hot baths and being in a remote area, she looked at it almost like a vacation. In February 1911, the girls would make the move to Seattle. They would have to wait weeks, but eventually they would move into the sanitarium named Wilderness Heights in nearby town Olalla. They would have to pay $60 a month for room, board, and its service, which is equivalent to almost $1,900 today. Dora and Claire decided not to tell anybody about what they were doing. They did not want family to judge them. This was a personal thing they felt they needed to do, and didn't feel like they should have to explain themselves to anyone. They had an Uncle John Herbert who lived a few hours away in Portland, Oregon, and they didn't even tell him. They practiced fasting before they went, but they found it incredibly difficult, so they'd often cheat on the so-called diet. Once they were in the sanitarium, however, they would not cheat. They would be completely submissive to Dr. Hazzard and followed the fasting instructions to a T. The diet consisted of 2 meals a day that would consist of tomato broth and asparagus juice, no solid foods and no meat. After a week, they would only be allowed 1 meal per day of the liquid diet. The so-called doctor did not even give the girls a physical examination before accepting them as patients and treating them. Dr. Hazzard said that a physical examination wasn't necessary. Treatments would consist of pressing into their backs and heads and slapping them violently, leaving red patches. Also, enemas would be performed that would last all day. Both treatments would rid the toxins from the body. Dr. Hazzard would tell the girls to walk and exercise as much as they could. That would also help during the fast, she said. She would go on to tell her stories of all the people she has saved, and that her fasting program has cured all kinds of diseases, including cancer. But the Williamson sisters did not know of the evil that was now in their presence, the evil that was Linda Hazzard. They did not know about the deaths that were occurring under the doctor's care. Patients were starving to death, and instead of saving them, the doctor was basically making sure it happened and then picking the patient's pocket. And in some of these cases, the patient's pockets would run very deep. Just 17 days before the Williamson sisters arrived in Seattle, a young British man named Ivan Flux had died under the doctor's care. He had come from Gloucester with lots of money in hopes of purchasing land somewhere in the Pacific Northwest. Hazzard did the autopsy and determined that he died of pneumonia. His money had disappeared, all but $70. She had been left in control of his estate after only knowing him a short while, and now she had ownership of his properties to do as she pleased. If we go back a year before this death to the fall of 1909, there was another suspicious incident, and this one involved a young man of British royalty. The young man's name was Eugene Wakeland, and he was actually the son of an English lord. He died from a .38 caliber shot to the head, and it was reported as a suicide. Linda Hazzard happened to be the power of attorney over his estate, and she would end up complaining when she learned he didn't have as much money as she thought he did. Fast forward to March 1910. Earl Erdman had come to seek help from Dr. Hazzard for his indigestion problem. The young man was starved and given day-long enemas. He had grown so weak he had to be transported to the hospital. His eyes were sunken. He looked like a corpse that had been dead for a while. He was so thin his ribs were poking out of his skin. His only chance was to receive a blood transfusion. He ended up not making it. He looked like an old man when he died, and he was only 24. Lewis Emerson Rader died May 11, 1908, after fasting for 29 days under the doctor's care. Rader had served in Congress for the state of Washington. Investigators wanted to bring a case against the doctor, but they soon learned that Rader's stomach, heart, and other vital organs were removed, and they were never found. The list goes on. Returning to the Williamson sisters, the girls endured agony for months. They tried to stay in good spirits, but they were in excruciating agony with these treatments and for not eating. Neighbors would hear them in distress, moaning and groaning all throughout the day and night. The Williamsons were losing an enormous amount of weight. They looked so sickly and had trouble walking a lot of times outside. One neighbor described Claire's smile as haunting, and speaking of the girls together, that their roomy eyes were hollow and their hands bony, with their knuckles raising the skin up like a tent. Another neighbor would hear Dr. Hazzard chastising the girls, telling them they would not be permitted to eat until their breath was sweet. The doctor would inspect the girls' tongues and degrade them, calling them dirty. Girls would get so weak from not eating properly for such a prolonged amount of time, they had to be transported by an ambulance to a hospital. In the ambulance, Sam Hazzard would strongly encourage Claire to update her will, so that the doctor would be in control of her estate, and Claire's body was to be cremated under the doctor's direction after she passed. Also, Claire's diamonds and 25 pounds per year would be given to the institution. And there was no doubt that Dr. Hazzard would be performing the autopsy. Sadly, Claire would end up dying shortly after on May 18, 1911. Dr. Hazzard had struck again, and the evil fasting specialist would end up desecrating the body. Hazzard would later be sued in a civil trial for causing emotional distress from desecrating a corpse by cutting out Claire's organs and embalming her body. Dr. Hazzard was never selfless and always greedy. She had stolen approximately $6,000 worth of jewelry from the girls. Margaret Conway was sent a coded telegram to get her to come to see Claire under the guise that Claire had sent it. When Margaret realized that this telegram indicated an emergency situation, she would board a steamship to find Claire. But when Margaret finally got to the port of Olalla, she learned from Sam Hazzard that Claire had already died, and she was devastated. Sam went on to say in an uncaring way that Dora had gone insane. Margaret did not feel any better when she got to the sanitarium. Starved patients were begging her to save them, saying they were being held against their will. Margaret met Linda Hazzard, and red flags continued to go off. The doctor did not offer any condolences. She spoke of how sick the girls were from the moment they arrived, which was an outright lie. She spoke in graphic detail of how most of Claire's organs were so weak she couldn't even puncture them with a knife. It was truly bizarre and sickening. The statements were wildly inappropriate. Hazzard would show her Claire's body, which was embalmed, and this was horrifying. Margaret and Uncle John Herbert would both testify later that the body was not even Claire, in their opinion. The body had been switched out with somebody that was not so thin, and probably Claire was cremated. Margaret would go and see Dora. Margaret was going to move in and care for Dora as her nurse, and nobody was going to stop her. Dora barely weighed 50 pounds at this point. She was in constant pain, and her bones were sticking out of her body. Margaret would make sure that Dora ate solid foods with sustenance, but she needed to get out of there. Dr. Hazzard would not allow Dora to leave. Dr. Hazzard had appointed herself Dora's guardian, and Hazzard would say that she was owed $2,000 from services provided to Dora. and it seemed to Hazzard's dismay that Dora was not going to die for Hazzard to get all of her property and control of her estate. Dora's Uncle John Herbert ended up arriving from Portland, and he was furious that no one notified him ahead of time of his niece's arrival there. And now Claire was dead. John Herbert would say that they were going to be leaving and nobody was going to get in their way. The Hazzards were paid less than $1,000, and now Dora was finally free, and she would survive. Dora would learn that she had given Sam Hazzard power of attorney without her knowledge, and money had been taken from her and Claire by the Hazzards. Dora would recount how one night at the sanitarium, Dr. Hazzard in a subtle way suggested Dora kill herself by jumping out of her bedroom window. Dora absolutely despised the woman who put her and her sister through this hell. Claire's death would be the straw that broke the camel's back when news reached the British Vice Consul. Linda Hazzard would be arrested and charged with the murder of Claire. She would cry that she was being persecuted because of political bias. The case against her was pretty solid. Frank Kelly tried the case. 3 medical experts would testify that Claire died of starvation, despite Hazzard's cause, which was cirrhosis of the liver. Linda had written in her book, "Death in the fast never results from deprivation of food, but is the inevitable consequence of vitality sapped to the last degree by organic imperfection." Linda Hazzard had one loyal nurse at the sanitarium, Nellie Sherman, in her corner, willing to take the witness stand. But her statements defending the doctor would usually be contradicted of what she would tell others. Dora would take the stand for the prosecution, and the truth would finally come out about the horrible treatment of her and her sister, and that the doctor and her husband were stealing from them, while they were essentially torturing them. They would sign Dora and Claire's names on traveler's checks and transfer orders, or whatever they could get their hands on. Linda Hazzard was found guilty of manslaughter on February 7, 1912. She was sentenced to 2 to 20 years. Margaret and Claire were happy for the sentence, but it was very short-lived. Hazzard would end up being granted parole after serving only 2 years in Walla Walla's Washington State Prison. She had her license revoked. Hazzard ended up being pardoned by the governor under the condition she left the country. She would go to live in New Zealand for 4 years before returning to the U.S. to open a school for health. In 1935, her sanitarium would end up burning to the ground when it was deliberately set on fire. In 1938, she would ultimately fall victim to her own fasting method when she ended up starving to death.